Now, the G20 Summit has begun in Indonesia under the shadow of the Ukraine war. World leaders converged in Bali to discuss global issues. Indonesian President Joko Widodo opened the summit and told G20 members that they must avoid another world war.
We should not divide the world into parts. We must not allow the world fall into another Cold War.
Let's first take a look at the agenda. Food and energy security has become the top priority. It's a fallout of the war in Ukraine and also because of the declining world economy. Countries that are not remotely involved in the war, they too are facing the brunt. The July agreement to get Ukrainian grain moving again was a breakthrough. It helped poorer nations cope with food shortage around the world. Last month, it had hit a roadblock when Putin briefly walked away from the agreement, even though the plan is now up and running. Western leaders will try to put a mechanism in place to deal with future roadblocks. The COVID-19 pandemic was way up on the agenda till last year, but now the focus has shifted to the post-COVID phase. World leaders are gathering to shape the new world. The virus still exists, but countries seem ready to move to the next phase now. Ahead of the summit, bilateral meetings overshadowed the summit itself. Joe Biden and Xi Jinping's closed-door meet is still making the headlines. The Chinese leader also sat down with his French counterpart. Experts say that since cementing his power at home, Xi is seeming much more open to keep the channels of dialogue open with the world. Russian President Vladimir Putin is skipping this year's summit, but not a single meeting is expected to go without his mention. The war is in its 9th month. Russian troops have lost ground in the only provincial capital they'd captured. However, there is still fear of Russia planning a trap to get ahead of the Ukrainians. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is carrying the baton this time around. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was seen sitting side by side in the first session. French President also joined shortly after. Now, it's unclear at this point if there are any bilateral meetings scheduled between the two leaders. For more on this, an international affairs expert, Professor James D.J. Brown, is joining us live from Tokyo now. Thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast.
Thank you.
Professor, what sort of commitments and resolutions are you expecting from the G20 summit, especially on food and energy security?
Well, I think that what we're seeing coming out of the meeting so far, the big headline seems to be to do with the draft communique. Going into the G20, there was the expectation that it would be very difficult to agree on any tough language to do with the war in Ukraine. But actually, it seems like the leaders are going to be able to go further than was expected. And it seems like the draft communique will include some language stating that this must not be an era of war, and also describing any use of nuclear weapons as inadmissible. And if that is indeed what is agreed upon, I think that can be read as really quite strong criticism of Russia's war in Ukraine.
Right. Now, when it comes to regional cooperation, what can you tell us of Japan's role, especially at a time of heightened tensions between North and South Korea, as well as tensions in the Taiwan Strait?
Yes, so Japan's position here is very much to support the position of the G7 when it comes to the issues to do with the global economy, the war in Ukraine, but it also has its own priorities too. And whilst there won't be a meeting between Kishida and President Xi at the G20, one will follow soon afterwards at the APEC summit on Thursday. We're also expecting a bilateral meeting between Kishida and the South Korean President, President Yoon, and there will also be important bilateral meetings between the Japanese leader and his Indonesian counterpart. So what's really going on here is Japan seeking to improve its bilateral relations with key kind of partners within the region.
Right. Now, what issues do you think will top the agenda for Japan at the summit? Japanese Prime Minister also to meet China's Xi Jinping on Thursday from what we know so far. So what can we expect from that?
Well, after all, the G20 is originally primarily an economic body. And so I think from the Japanese point of view, a major priority will be the state of the global economy. And as you mentioned earlier on, we're just receiving the news about Japan's economy having undergone a contraction of 1.2% during the last quarter. And so I think from the Japanese side, a real priority will be to try and return some stability to the global economy, to take off some of the price pressures, and then hopefully that would feed into a better situation for Japan's own economy.
All right. Professor James D.J. Brown, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.